You probably know about the Kitty Genovese case, even if you don't recognize her name. You might have read about it in a sociology textbook or in a pop psychology article online, or maybe you've just heard of the term the bystander effect. It's the case of that poor woman who was brutally attacked and killed in the city in front of dozens of people, and no one stopped to help or even call the cops. But it wasn't actually true. Not only was the story verifiably false, but the most important part of the story has been left out. And it's just one of the many reasons why we need Pride Month. Let's get into it. Hey, howdy, hello, and welcome back. If you're new here, welcome. I'm Delaney, a true crime writer and all-around murder nerd. On this channel, I like to take deep dives into the worst cases, and I tend to cuss a lot. So, if you're into that sort of thing, go ahead and subscribe. If not, that's cool, you do you. So, now let's talk about the case of Kitty Genovese. And to do so, I need to tell you two different stories. One is the old story, splashed across headlines and written about in sociology and psychology textbooks for decades. It's been talked about so much, it's become part of the American true crime canon. Is that even a thing? I say it's a thing. It's become almost legendary for what it supposedly showed us about human nature. But I also want to tell another very different story, one that hasn't really been told until recently. So first, the standard story. On March 13th, 1964, 28-year-old bar manager Kitty Genovese, who went by Kitty, was raped and stabbed to death outside her apartment building in New York City. According to a New York Times article written soon afterwards, 38 people saw or heard the attack but did nothing. The nation was rightfully shocked, and the phenomenon was studied intensely by psychologists and sociologists. For decades, her murder was a staple case study in psychology classes. It was her case that led them to coin the term the bystander effect, which is the social psychological theory that individual people are less likely to offer help to a victim when there are other people around. Social psychologists attribute this to two factors. First, the diffusion of responsibility, the idea that someone else will probably help, so I don't have to, as well as social influence, the idea that people take their cues on how to act based on what everyone else around them is doing. But as the case got more scrutiny in recent years, researchers began to see that maybe the story we'd all been told wasn't quite the whole truth. Kitty Genovese grew up in an Italian and Irish-American working-class neighborhood in Brooklyn. She was known by her friends and classmates at her Catholic school as a chatterbox, and she was popular, self-confident, and a lot of fun to be around. After graduation, she was briefly married to a man, but the marriage was quickly annulled once she realized who she really was. Because she was a lesbian, a fact that is crucial to understanding this case. Kitty then worked several odd jobs before becoming the manager of a bar in Queens. She was reliable and hardworking. The other workers and regulars considered her as one of the guys, and she often worked double shifts to save money for her dream, to open her own Italian restaurant. On March 13, 1963, she met Marianne Zelonko, and they fell in love right away. They lived in a motel room together for 2 weeks until they lucked into a second-floor apartment near the railway station in Kew Gardens, a working-class neighborhood that was home to a lot of LGBTQ folks. Though they had to pretend they were just friends in public, the two were deeply in love. They had their regular Monday night beers and folk music at a club called Greed's, and Wednesday dinners at Hofbrau, the German restaurant just down the block. Kitty even bought Marianne a miniature poodle that they named Andrew. On their first anniversary, Kitty got off work around 3 a.m. She parked her car at the railway station and began walking home in the frigid winter night. At that time of night, all the businesses were closed, the streets were empty, and most of the apartment windows were dark. In other words, the perfect hunting ground for a killer. Earlier that same night, 29-year-old Winston Moseley had snuck out of his home, leaving his kids sleeping while his wife worked the night shift. He cruised the dark streets of Queens looking for his next victim. He spotted Kitty at a stoplight and followed her to her parking spot. He parked down the street and grabbed his hunting knife, then got out of his car and followed Kitty. She was fairly close to her apartment building when she heard footsteps behind her, so she started running towards the front of the building. But he ran after her, caught her, and stabbed her twice in the back. She screamed for help, and several neighbors did hear her, but only a few of them realized that it was a cry for help. But one of her neighbors, Robert Moser, did realize what was going on and shouted down at Winston to get out of here. This scared Winston, so he ran back to his car. A witness would later say that after this initial attack, his father had also called the police to report that a woman had been attacked. But apparently it wasn't followed up on. Meanwhile, Kitty, bloody but still alive, limped towards the rear entrance to her apartment. There, she collapsed from blood loss in the foyer, out of sight of any other witnesses. After a few minutes and not hearing any sirens, Winston decided the coast was clear. So he went back to the scene and followed the trail of blood to Kitty to finish what he started. There, in the entryway to her apartment building, he stabbed her repeatedly and SA'd her, then took all the money out of her wallet, $49. He then left her there to die. The one example of what seemed to be the type of callousness that was the point of the Times story was that of Carl Ross, who lived right at the top of the stairs. When he heard Kitty's screams, he opened his door and saw her lying in a pool of blood at the bottom of the stairs. He immediately closed his door. He then called a neighbor, who urged him to come over and call the cops from her phone. He crawled out of his window and across the roof to her apartment, where he did finally call the cops. Meanwhile, Kitty's neighbor and friend, Sophie Farrar, heard the noises and rushed downstairs. By this point, Winston was already gone. But Sophie held and comforted her friend, assuring her that help was on the way. An ambulance arrived soon after Carl's call, but Kitty succumbed to her wounds en route to the hospital. In the aftermath, Marianne was somehow considered a suspect and was questioned by detectives on the morning after the murder. She was later interrogated again, this time for 6 hours, with the questions focused on her relationship with Kitty, including extremely intimate and inappropriate questions about their sex life. This was also what the police were focused on when they questioned the couple's neighbors. The police seemed to be more concerned about her lifestyle than finding her killer. At Kitty's funeral, the Genovese family refused to speak with Marianne or even acknowledge her existence in any way. Later, Kitty's father would steal Andrew from Marianne. Thankfully, though, her killer was not very bright. 6 days later, police were called to Ozone Park for a suspected burglary. A resident, Raoul Cleary, had seen Winston taking a TV out of his neighbor's house. Needless to say, that struck him as highly suspicious. So Raoul confronted Winston, who claimed he was a mover who'd been hired by the neighbor. But Raoul wasn't buying it. He talked to another neighbor, Jack Brown, who confirmed that the neighbors were not moving. So while Raoul called the police, Jack disabled Winston's car. When the police arrived, they found the stolen TV in Winston's trunk and arrested him. Just by sheer luck, a detective on the case recalled that a car similar to Winston's had been reported by some of the witnesses to Kitty's murder, so he informed the detective working on her case. Under questioning, Winston Moseley confessed to Kitty's murder, as well as 2 more, that of Annie Mae Johnson, who'd been shot, raped, and burned to death in her apartment in South Ozone Park a few weeks earlier. Also, 15-year-old Barbara Kralik, who'd been raped and killed in her own bedroom in Springfield Gardens the previous July. He also confessed to dozens more burglaries and rapes. His confession was extremely detailed and fit with the physical evidence. He said that his motive for the attack was just that he wanted to kill a woman. He said he preferred to kill women because, quote, they were easier and didn't fight back. He later had to undergo psychiatric evaluations, which diagnosed him as a necrophiliac. Winston was charged for Kitty's murder, but not the other 2. In Barbara Kralich's murder, another man had already confessed, so that complicated things. But why he wasn't charged with Annie Mae Johnson's murder, well, I have my suspicions. His trial began in June of 1964. He pled not guilty by reason of insanity. He took the stand in his own defense, where he again confessed in detail to 3 murders and all the other crimes. The jury deliberated for 7 hours before coming back with a guilty verdict. He was given the death sentence, though later it would be reduced to 20 years to life. He would later testify as a witness for the defense of Alvin Mitchell, the man who had falsely confessed to murdering Barbara Kralich, in exchange for immunity, so he was never charged with that murder. Despite Moseley's confession, Mitchell was still convicted of her murder. But Winston Moseley's conviction did not put an end to his violence. In 1968, he purposefully injured himself in order to get transferred to a hospital. He then escaped the transport vehicle by knocking out the corrections officer and stealing his weapon. He found an empty house and holed up there for 3 days. When the cleaning lady arrived the 3rd day, he raped her. She managed to escape and called the owners of the house, and they called the police. But the police told the homeowners that it was only an hour and a half till shift change, so she should call back later. Meanwhile, thinking the attacker had probably fled from the cops by now, the owners returned home. So Winston tied the man up, SA'd the woman, then stole their car and went to another house. There he held a mother and daughter hostage. Later he released them unharmed and surrendered to the police. He was charged with escape and kidnapping, to which he pled guilty. Apparently there were no charges for the sexual assault on the cleaning lady. He was given 2 additional 15-year sentences to run concurrently with his life sentence. Then, 3 years later, he took part in the infamous Attica prison riot, which deserves its own video. Winston Moseley died in prison on March 28, 2016, at the age of 81. Initially, the story of Kitty Genovese's murder didn't get much in the way of media coverage. But 2 weeks later, New York Times editor Abe Rosenthal was having lunch with the city police commissioner. The commissioner told him about the case and said it was, quote, one for the books. The story that was published relied heavily on the police's accounts, including the claim that 38 people witnessed the attack and did nothing. The story made national headlines for decades afterwards and triggered regular cycles of scolding and pearl clutching about the supposed urban apathy and indifference that it exposed. Her case did lead to some positive changes, though. Her murder and the story of the 38 bystanders helped pass Good Samaritan laws and led to the creation of the 911 system. But 40 years later, a local historian decided to take a closer look at that Times story. After some digging, he discovered that the New York Times story, which had been the basis for all the theories that came afterwards, was not at all accurate. First of all, the number of witnesses had been wildly inflated. Most of the 38, quote, witnesses had only heard screams, but couldn't see anything and didn't really know what was going on. And the neighborhood was near a bar, so residents said that screaming and yelling late at night wasn't that out of the ordinary. But most importantly, several people actually did call the cops. They said that the cops blew them off and told them that they'd already received the call. But the police call logs from that night don't show any calls about the attack until well after Winston was gone. So there's the distinct possibility that the police bungled their end and that commissioner came up with the story of no one did anything to cover for his department's incompetence or indifference. Kitty Genovese didn't die alone. Her friend Sophie Farrar took a great risk to come to her defense. She held her in her arms while she breathed her last, and I think that story deserves as much attention as the false claim that, quote, no one wanted to get involved. But I think there was an even bigger factor at work here, and it's the reason why we need pride. Remember that before 2003, in many states, being gay was outright illegal. LGBTQ folks were considered mentally insane, prone to violence, and, of course, pedophiles. Sound familiar?
For grooming.
Groomer.
Groomers.
And once you were arrested on suspicion of sodomy, that is, being gay, your mugshot would be splashed all over the papers. And since LGBTQ people didn't have federal civil rights protection until 2020, you could be fired from your job, blacklisted, evicted from your home, have your kids taken away, or worse. Kitty and her LGBTQ neighbors were the frequent targets of police harassment and persecution, and so would not have gone to them for help. In fact, the way Marianne was treated after Kitty's murder just shows how the cops treated LGBTQ folks. Carl Ross, the man who had seen Kitty at the bottom of the stairs and just closed the door, was himself a gay man. He had been distraught over it, torn between wanting to help his neighbor and being absolutely terrified of getting involved with the police. Right now, as we speak, there are hundreds of politicians, pundits, and personalities who are trying to bring back the lie that LGBTQ folks are insane child predators. They're spewing these lies and hatred on their TV shows, podcasts, and in the halls of Congress. And when that doesn't work, they show up with guns and violence. And the scary thing is, it's working. Several states, including my own, have banned books that feature LGBTQ characters, as well as banning anyone performing in drag where children might be present. This year, several Pride events have been canceled out of fear of attacks by the Proud Boys and other dickless neo-Nazis. These brain-dead fascists want to roll back the rights that have only very recently been won and go back to the bad old days when LGBTQ folks were forced into the closet. Even if you're not in the LGBTQ community, I hope you can see just how dangerous this is and do your part to put a stop to it. Don't just buy rainbow merch. Speak up when you hear people spreading lies about the LGBTQ community. Boycott businesses that discriminate against LGBTQ folks or who advertise on hateful shows and networks. Support civil rights protests however you can. Vote out politicians who pass these hateful bills. So if you're still here, thank you so much for spending time with me. If you like these kind of deep dives into horrible cases and the occasional political rant, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss another one. Till next time, Darklings. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more. You can help me make more true crime content by supporting me on Patreon, where for as little as a cup of coffee, you can get early access to videos, bonus content, and free Murder Nerd merch. The link is in the description.